Okay, Thomas Freed here. A number of people have asked me to do a video focusing on how you can take home your whole paycheck in these times of economic hardship. So why don't we go ahead and get right into that. Here, if you go to any employment attorney and ask them how come my employer has to take tax out of my paycheck, they'll tell you, well, the law requires us to do it. And, there are three taxes that are involved. I guess actually only two. The third tax is on the employer. The unemployment tax doesn't touch the employee. But you've got two taxes being withheld from the employees. One is Social Security. That comes about because you put your Social Security number on the W-4. I don't think anybody would object to that. It's just the 6%. The Social Security isn't terrible. That's not what kills you. What kills you is the income tax. You start at age 16 to 18, you click single and zero, and they withhold 30% of your check, and you don't have enough to get by on. So, uh, in these times of economic hardship, you can control that because no one can force you to pay a tax before it's legally due next year on April 15th. And trying to force you to pay it before then would be constituting imposing a condition of involuntary servitude, forcing you to service a future obligation before it was legally due. That's why they need the W-4 allowance certificate from you in order to withhold the tax on every paycheck, because there's no tax due until next year on April 15th, if any tax is due at all, and no one can force you to pay that beforehand. They want you to choose to let them to withhold too much so they get the free use of your money, and so that they'll get paid the tax, because they understand that if they don't collect the tax on every single paycheck come April 15th, no one will have the thousands of dollars necessary to pay the tax. So they want to take it from you with every paycheck, because otherwise it will become an unworkable system with the government in the face of half the people in the country forcing them to pay the tax that they don't have. So they steal it from your paycheck, and they get to spend the purchasing power of those dollars rather than you. And that way, the government takes the power, both political and economic power, because the political power is the economic power of the wallet. It takes it away from the people and usurps it for its own benefits at our expense. So, you go to an employment attorney and ask them, how come you're withholding the tax, income tax? And they will tell you Section 3402A. So here it is, 3402A, income tax collected at source, requirement of withholding. Except as otherwise provided in this section, every employer making payment of wages shall deduct and withhold upon such wages a tax determined in accordance with tables or computational procedures prescribed by the Secretary. Okay, so there it is. That's what they point to. Every employer making payment of wages shall deduct and withhold upon such wages a tax. We have to do it. We have to take this tax from you. The law says we have to take this tax. And I would point out that, wait a minute, what's this? Except as otherwise provided in this section. That's the opening clause of the statute. What kind of clause is that? That's a clause of subordination. It tells the reader to hold on a moment. This might not actually be the true force of law imparted by this code section, 3402, income tax collected at the source. You need to go and read all the other code sections to find out if there isn't something else that might be otherwise provided. So this is what they point to. We have to do it. But the very first thing in the code section, it says maybe they don't have to do it. So are the attorneys lying to you, or are they just not properly educated on the matter? Well, if you educate them, maybe you'll find out whether they're uneducated or lying to you. Okay, so except as otherwise provided. That means we have to go read the other code section. So we go through B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. F used to be exemptions, but it provided only for the exemption of the full-time student. But we get down here to N, subsection N, employees incurring no income tax liability. Notwithstanding any other provision of this section, an employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold any tax under this chapter upon a payment of wages to an employee if there is in effect with respect to such payment a withholding exemption certificate in such form and containing such other information as the Secretary may prescribe, furnished to the employer by the employee, certifying that the employee, 1, incurred no liability for income tax imposed under Subtitle A for his preceding year, and 2, anticipates that he will incur no liability for income tax imposed under Subtitle A for his current taxable year. Okay, well, this seems to contradict subsection A that says you do have to withhold. This says the employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold. So the question is, which code section is the superior section? Which is the supremacy clause and which is the subordinated clause? We already saw that A starts with except as otherwise provided. That's a clause of subordination. It says maybe something else. And here we find an N. It says notwithstanding any other provision. You know what notwithstanding means? No, apparently most of the attorneys don't know either, because notwithstanding essentially means here regardless of. So now you read this section, regardless of any other provision of the section, an employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold any tax. Oh my God, you mean the command of this section 3402 is actually not a command that the employer will hold tax, but rather it is a command under subsection N that he shall not withhold any tax, notwithstanding any other provision, regardless of any other provision, an employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold. And what are the conditions under which he is not required and actually forbidden? If you have no income tax liability under Subtitle A in the preceding year and anticipate none. So don't you wish you knew what Subtitle A was? And how liability is established? Well, let's look at that, shall we? Here you go. Here's Title 26, United States Code. Subtitle A is the income taxes, sections 1 through 1564. Subtitle A is the body of law, the legislation that was enacted in 1913, the original income tax laws. And Subtitle C, where this section 34.2 is in the employment tax laws. That's over here in Chapter 24, collection of the tax at the source, 3402. Income tax collected at the source, and here's the section we were just looking at in the other format, except as otherwise provided. Subsection N says, notwithstanding, no collection of the tax. Now notice that in Chapter 24, there is no tax imposed. It's the first section is definitions, and then it goes right to collection at the source, giving the employer the authority to collect tax when an employee asks for it. When the employee asks for it. So Subtitle A is the original legislation that was enacted in 1913. Now, how is liability established? Well, liability is established in the statutes. If there isn't liability in the statute created and imposed, the courts can't enforce it because the courts can only enforce what is in the law. So let's look at what happens with the Subtitle A code. Okay, Subtitle A code is the original body of law from 1913, upheld by the Supreme Court in 1916. And in it, it created a whole new class of tax collectors to administer to the collection and payment of the federal income tax. And that, let's see, can we shrink this a little bit? Okay. Subtitle A, this is actually from section 7701A. It's the withholding agent. This is the tax collector for the Subtitle A tax. Here are the provisions in Subtitle A that define the requirement: 1441, 1442, 1443, and most importantly, 1461. We'll see why. 1441 tells the Subtitle A income tax collector to collect the tax from non-resident aliens. 1442 tells the collector to collect from foreign corporations. 1443 says to collect from foreign tax or exempt organizations at a slightly slower rate. And 1461 is liability for withheld tax. Oh, look, here's a statute in Subtitle A that makes a person liable for the tax. Who's it make liable? Every person required to deduct and withhold any tax under this chapter is hereby made liable for such tax and is herein indemnified against the claim. So every person required to deduct and withhold is the person made liable. It's the withholding agent, the tax collector. And he only turns over what he's collected from foreign persons. And there is no authority to collect from citizens, only the non-resident aliens, the foreign corporations, and tax-exempt organizations, foreign, of 1441, 1442, 1443, and then liability of the collector under 1461. This is the only statute that makes anyone liable for tax in Subtitle A. So did you collect any tax from the non-resident aliens last year? Do you anticipate doing so this year? No, you don't do business with non-resident aliens, so you have no liability for tax because you collected none from no foreign persons? Well, then you have the legal right to claim exempt on your W-4. You have the legal right to claim exempt because you can prove that you had no liability for tax under Subtitle A because that section 1461 is the only code section. Here, let's run down here, and here's liability for tax. Here are all the other statutes for liability. And in Subtitle A, you have 1461 making the tax collector liable, the withholding agent, for all the taxes withheld from non-resident aliens and other foreign persons. And 1463 says it's that tax collector who's liable for the penalties and interest as well. It's not the worker who is liable for the penalties and interest. It's the tax collector who's liable for failing to administer to the duty to collect the tax from the foreign person. And look, 32 years later, in 1945, they did exactly the same thing. They made the employer liable for what he's collected. They created a whole new class of tax collectors, just like they did in 1913 with the withholding agents. In 1945, they create a whole new class of tax collectors called employers, because employment wasn't part of the tax code. Before World War II, no Americans paid tax on their wages. Employment wasn't part of the code. Only the withholding agents collected from foreign persons. And 32 years later, in 1945, they imposed the same scheme where it is the employer who is now added as a collector, and the withholding agent is only allowed and only required and only authorized to collect from foreign persons. And that's why they had to add a new class of collectors, the employers, because they can collect from citizens, but only where the citizen allows it and asks for it on a W-4 by being ignorant of these 3402N provisions that let the citizen claim exempt from the withholding of tax on their labor, because there's no tax imposed. It was imposed on the labor of the foreign persons. That's in section 1441. Let's go look at that real quick. Here we go, 1441. And we go right down to B, where we see the items of income referred to in subsection A, i.e. taxed for the non-resident alien, are interest, dividends, rent, salaries, wages. Oh, look, salaries and wages are here. When salaries and wages are earned by a non-resident alien, they're taxable under 1441B, and they're collected by the withholding agent who's made liable for the payment of the tax under 1461. And what about section 61? Gross income. Oh, look. Gross income means all income from whatever source derived, including compensation for services, including fees, commissions, fringe benefits, and similar. Well, compensation was in 1441 as a separate item. Here it is, salaries, wages, compensation. But now salaries and wages are removed from Section 61. They're not in gross income. Salaries and wages of citizens were never made subject to the tax. Only the salaries and wages of the non-resident alien. They're letting you assume that you're subject to the tax since World War II, when they imposed the victory tax on you for 2 years and unconstitutionally taxed your labor directly. But when that war revenue measure expired and they realized that no one had sued to stop the unconstitutional taxation of labor in the direct manner being done, they decided they couldn't let it go. But they realized if they had a tax that directly taxed the labor, that would be problematic and would be declared unconstitutional. So they removed salaries and wages from Section 61, which previously, as Section 22A, had included salaries and wages and compensation, because the code section, Section 22A, which became Section 61, was enacted under a Canadian tax treaty. It never had any applicability to domestic income. It was always only foreign income in Canada that was earned. But in 1954, they decided to start fraudulently using Section 61 because its origin in 1918 under a Canadian treaty had been lost. And they intended to deceive the American people to make them believe that all of their items of gross income were taxable when they weren't. But if they had salaries and wages in there, that would be a direct tax on labor. So they removed it from Section 61 and just waited for some judge to use judicial legislation to put it back. And that's exactly what happened. Some judge, socialist-minded judge, said, oh, well, salaries and wages are a form of compensation, so now everything you do is taxable. So it's all done by judicial legislation to bring to bear the force of law. It's not in the written law. Salaries and wages aren't there in Section 61 as sources of taxable gross income. All three, compensation, salaries, and wages, are listed as separate and distinct sources when earned by a non-resident alien under 1441B, and two of those sources are removed from gross income when earned by a citizen. So it's not in the law, they're making it up. And you have no liability for tax under Subtitle A, neither last year or this year, unless you collected tax from a non-resident alien. So you have the legal right to claim exempt on your W-4. Now, how do you do that becomes the question, because they've put out a new form that doesn't want to let you do that. And even the new form, take a notice here, right? Here's the W-4 Employees Withholding Allowance Certificate. This is the form that you should use, because the new form, they try to take the exempt claim away from you, but it's still in the statutes as the supremacy clause controlling the withholding. They've just started to remove it from the form because people like me have been helping thousands of people for 25 years claim exempt legally and defeat them with this nonsense about you have to give us your money before April 15th and be an involuntary servitude peon. So they're trying to hide this from you, but the law says in any form that the secretary, in the form the secretary requires, containing all the information the law needs, and this old form provides that, so this is what you should use. There's an old form of W-4 that I can show you where to get one of these, okay? So this is the Employees Withholding Allowance Certificate that you should be using. And you don't put single or married with, but you don't do this. You're not single or married, you're exempt. You don't claim any exemptions, not applicable, you're exempt. You don't want any additional amount, zero. You claim exempt under IRC 3402, you put your name, your address down, you sign it, and you give it to them. That's all they need, is to know that you're exempt. You don't claim single because that triggers a rate. Married triggers a different rate. The withholding numbers adjust the rates. You're exempt. You don't give them these specifications that lock you into a class. You put the year right up here, and you got to put in the year for like 24 now, 25 for next year. You use a, what do they call them? A fine black magic marker. It slipped my mind, but you know what I'm talking about. Just use a fine magic marker, a black pen to draw, block in the year for it. You sign it, you give it to them as exempt, and your employer should honor it. Now, if your employer has a problem with honoring that, you come right over here to irszoom.com. You can click on the store, come right down here to give yourself a raise, and you can pop right in. Here you go. Now, here is the W-4 document I just showed you, available for $5. And up above, I have the letter that you can give to your employer defending the exempt claim if he gives you a hard time. So you just come on over here to irszoom.com. You can buy the W-4 exemption doc for $5. Give it to your employer. If there's any problem, you come back, you buy the defending your exempt claim, which goes through the laws I've just showed you. 1441 is the liability. 3402N is the supremacy clause, and 3402A, which is subordinated, and the clause that they cite turns out to be a subordinated authority to the supremacy clause that you're citing them as your right to be exempt, and then challenge them on how can you force me to pay a tax that isn't due until April 15th? That's involuntary servitude. That's why they need the W-4 allowance certificate, is because they can't collect the tax without your permission because it's not due until April 15th. There's no force of law behind collection until April 15th. Unless you fail to make any specification. Now, when you fill out that W-4 form, it's important that you don't write anything else on it, or they'll claim that invalidates the claim and try to override it. And if the IRS tries to override the exempt claim, you can appeal that decision through a CDP hearing and go to take them into legal proceedings to stop the unlawful conversion of your property in the name of tax, because none of this money being taken from your paycheck is actually going in the Treasury as required by law. That's easy too. Why don't we just come right over here? We'll pop over here and we'll go to 7809, deposit of collections. Here you have it. Code section 7809, except as provided, the gross amount of all taxes and revenues received under the provisions of this title and collections of whatever nature received or collected by authority of any internal revenue law shall be paid daily into the Treasury of the United States. And that daily requirement is modified to weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and most employers send it in quarterly. And it concludes by saying a certificate of such payment stating the name of the depositor and the specific account on which the deposit was made, signed by the Treasurer of the United States. Now, this means they need to create a deposit certificate that credits your account, the Social Security number, and your employer for making the deposit into your account to your credit. But if you call the Treasury on January 10th and tell them you think your employer made a mistake, how much do they have recorded as tax being withheld by your employer? You think he made a mistake on a W-2 that you just got. How much do they have recorded as being taken? They'll have to tell you zero. Zero. Now, your employer's been taking money out of your paycheck all year long, and this law says it has to be deposited in the Treasury at the end of every quarter. How is it possible 14 months later there's no deposit of any of the tax? Never went in the Treasury. Is that because it wasn't taxed? Because there was no tax imposed, and there was no tax imposed in 1913, and there was no new tax imposed in 1945 in Chapter 24? So none of this money you're letting them take out of your paycheck, believing it is tax, is actually tax? And since it's not tax, they don't have to put it in the Treasury. They can do whatever they want with it. And what are they doing with it? They're sending it to the Federal Reserve Bank to collateralize the $35 trillion in debt. And as long as the American people allow themselves to be collectively reduced to the state of the peons and the serfs, who exist only to collateralize the debt of the masters owed to the king, you will be enslaved to an ever greater extent as long as you allow that collateralization of your labor to occur. So until America stops claiming exempt, or starts claiming exempt, you're going to be enslaved by the $35 trillion, which Congress is going to continue to run up. So right here is the key. Employees withholding allowance certificate. They call it a W-4 because they don't want you to read it. Withholding allowance. That's not allowance, as in they're giving you $2.50 a week to walk the dog, feed the cat, and take out the trash. This is allowance, as in your permission to collect money that isn't due until next year on April 15th. And if you don't give them your permission, your allowance, they can't take it because there's no tax imposed, there's no tax due, and there's no law requiring the employer to collect it as long as you claim exempt, because you have no liability under 1461 for liability for tax. 1461, no liability for tax. And what did the employer get told? Claiming to be a person not subject to withholding. 1.1441.5. This is the Code of Regulations. For the purposes of Chapter 3 of the Code, an individual's written statement that he or she is a citizen or resident of the United States may be relied upon by the payer of the income as proof that such individual is a citizen or resident of the United States, and therefore is outside the authority of the withholding agent. And this statement shall be furnished to the withholding agent in duplicate. An alien may claim residence in the United States by filing. Okay, and here it tells them what to do with the form. Now, this has to do with the collection authority of the withholding agent, because if you're a non-resident alien and you take a job with an employment, your employer is serving both as an employer for administration of the unemployment tax and the Social Security tax, and he's serving as a withholding agent with a duty and a requirement to collect tax from the non-resident alien employee. So your employer could be a withholding agent, but only if you're a non-resident alien. And if you're not a non-resident alien, then he can only administer the unemployment tax and the Social Security tax, and there is no legal authority for him to enforce you to pay or to allow to be withheld the federal income tax. That's hinged upon liability for tax in Subtitle A, and the only liability for tax in Subtitle A is the liability of the tax collector, the same way that the only liability that exists in law for the payment of a sales tax is the liability of the store to turn over what it has collected. And it is the store that gets in trouble if they don't collect. They don't go ask the store for the names and addresses of 100,000 people so they don't get the 4 cents for the Coca-Cola they bought. They come to the store and tell the store you screwed up. You failed to administer to the duty, collect the tax, and now you got to pay it. Not because that's the way it's imposed, but because that's the penalty for failing to administer to the duty to collect it. You had the chance to shift the burden. For some reason, you chose not to and didn't collect it at the cash register. We're not going to go knock on 100,000 doors to get 4 cents. That'll bankrupt the state. You, the store, are now responsible for the payment of the tax. Some stores actually use this as a marketing advantage. Macy's on Black Friday often says, come do your shopping at Macy's and we'll pay the tax. They're spending their advertising budget on the tax, hoping they'll make it up in volume. If enough people come to the store, they can pay the tax. So if the withholding agent or the employer fails to pay the tax, they can get in trouble, but not if the citizen properly claims their exemption on the W-4. So you can get it, the exemption again over here at irszoom.com. And again, you just click over here on the store. Let's see, can we make this easier to see? Okay, you just click right here. Just click right here on the store, and up it pops. Down here is the give yourself a raise. Here's the simple truth about income tax. Now, you really ought to pick this up too. This is just $4. It's the 75-page PDF file that lays out everything that went down with the Subtitle A income tax laws in 1913. So this helps you get the understanding of what I just went through with the withholding agent in the 1441A and B, and salaries and wages and gross income being under Canadian. That's all right here in the simple truth about income tax. So for $4, you get the whole background history on the tax, and for $5, you get the exemption document example, which they've removed and are starting to use a different document. But like I say, the law clearly says that you can give them a form as long as it contains the information that is required by law. Oh, and let's look at one last thing. You might want to notice here that in this, on the allowance certificate, they say 7, I claim exemption from withholding for 2019, and I certify that I meet both of the following conditions for exemption. Last year, I had a right to a refund of all federal income tax withheld because I had no tax liability. Well, now, wait a minute. This year, I expect a refund of all federal income tax withheld because I expect, well, that's not what the statute said. The statutes didn't say anything at all about a refund. They said only no liability. So they're lying to you on the form here to try and deceive you about your right to claim exempt. They're trying to tell you that if you didn't claim exempt or if you weren't liable and didn't work last year, then you can't ever be exempt. And that's not what the statute says. What the statute says is if you have no liability under Subtitle A. It doesn't say anything about needing a refund because you didn't understand the tax law and paid some last year. This is them trying to hide the law from you and take away from you your right to claim exempt by altering the statutory requirement to something that isn't there. Because the what isn't there, the refund, supports their de facto operation and your ignorant history of making yourself subject and peon to a tax because you didn't understand the law. And now they're trying to say because you did that once, you're stuck with it for the rest of your life. Well, no, I'm sorry. You have altered the law, and this form loses force of law where you've altered it. I'm going to stick with the statutes and argue no liability for tax under Subtitle A under 3402N. And it says nothing here about needing a refund, and regulations can't add things that aren't in the statute. The regulations can only implement what the statute says. It can't add to it or make it larger or enlarge its capacity, force of law, or legal effect. That's not legal law. Regulations aren't law if they go beyond the statute. And here's a form that goes beyond the statute by claiming this right to refund nonsense, which isn't in the law. But as long as you can show them the law, they can't argue the form in place of the law. The law controls everybody. All you have to do is know what the word notwithstanding means. Because apparently the legal attorneys don't have that word in their vocabulary. They claim subsection A requires them to withhold the tax. And it's not true. It's just not true. Subsection A does not require them. It specifically, except as otherwise provided. Except as otherwise provided. And here's the exception. N, notwithstanding any other provision, an employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold any tax. So that's how you do it. You use an old exempt form because the new forms have taken away that ability to claim exempt. They're hiding the law from you. But if you know the law, they can't claim it's been replaced by a form. The form actually violates the law, and it does so intentionally to deceive you about the nature of the withholding, which they want you to think is absolutely mandatory and can't be escaped. But that's completely 100% unconstitutional because there's no tax due until next year on April 15th, and no one can force you to pay or service a tax before it's legally due without violating the constitutional prohibition on involuntary servitude in the 13th Amendment. So they're violating the Constitution to keep the American people enslaved. And that's pretty much the bottom line on all of this, isn't it? So tax-freedom.com, irszoom.com. Get yourself a copy of The Simple Truth About Income Tax for just $4 over at irszoom.com. Get yourself a copy of the exemption document for just $5 at irszoom.com. And if you want to get fully informed, get yourself a copy of the American Tax Bible. That too is available at irszoom.com for just $50. It's a 780-page PDF that lays out everything from beginning to end, has all of this information, and a whole lot more. Okay, if you like the video, share it, and tell others to subscribe. Get informed. The truth shall make you free, and everything else is going to enslave you. Okay, this is Thomas Freed, taxfreedom.com and the Thomas Freed YouTube channel. Check it out, get informed, get educated.